A couple of years ago, I gave a talk about a hero of mine, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and the congregation responded well to it. So I could talk about other heroes like Martin Luther King Jr. or Gandhi, but I know that they are well known to you. So I thought I would talk a little about two other heroes and a heroine that may not be well known to a UU congregation: Will Campbell, Clarence Jordan, and Dorothy Day, two Baptists and a Catholic. I'm going to start with Will Campbell, whom I heard speak 3 times, first as the guest at a Presbyterian Peacemakers Conference, and the other 2 times at the invitation of Baptists. I've also read a number of his books. He was born in Mississippi in 1924, the son of farmers, cotton growers. He credits his parents with raising him culturally tolerant, but the church used Bibles with the Ku Klux Klan symbol on the cover. He was ordained a Baptist minister at age 17 and went on to college, but dropped out to be a medic in World War II. He finished his bachelor's education at Wake Forest University in North Carolina after the war, and then graduated from Yale Divinity School. He did have a Baptist pastorate for 2 years, but then went to work as the director of religious life at the University of Mississippi. This lasted 2 years also, because he received death threats for championing integration at the school. His next job was as a field officer for the National Council of Churches. This gave him wide latitude to be anywhere civil rights was being fought for. For example, he was one of 4 whites who escorted the 4 Black students entering high school in Little Rock, Arkansas, during the Eisenhower administration. And he returned to the Mississippi campus when Governor Barnett tried to block James Meredith from enrolling after he had won the right in a Supreme Court decision. Will Campbell was also at the University of Alabama when Governor George Wallace stood in the entrance of the administration building, blocking admission of Black students. He assisted freedom riders, integrating interstate buses in 1961 in the midst of violence in Alabama. We've just honored John Lewis this summer, and he was one of those who was badly beaten as a freedom rider in Alabama, 4 years before he was struck again on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in 1965. This was the era when many pastors were asked to leave their churches in the South because they spoke out against segregation. And often this happened after they had invited Will Campbell to preach on a Sunday in their church. Perhaps most famously, he was the only white person present when the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was formed in 1957. This was the preeminent organization that Martin Luther King Jr. led during his lifetime. Some Black ministers opposed Campbell becoming a charter member, but Bayard Ruskin sponsored him. Remember that Bayard was gay, and although he did most of the work to organize the 1963 March on Washington, he couldn't speak on the podium because of his LGBT status. In 1963, Campbell left the National Council of Churches staff and became a founder and the director of the Committee of Southern Churchmen, which was made up of many pro-civil rights pastors who had lost their church positions. They published Catallagate, a journal whose name means reconciliation in Greek. He settled in Mount Juliet, Tennessee, outside Nashville. Since the journal was edited and printed out of Berea, Kentucky, and I lived there for 3 years during my 20s, I heard a number of stories about Will Campbell. A favorite one of mine was his being challenged by his brother about loving his enemies. This part is actually in his first book, Brother to a Dragonfly. His brother asked him if he really took seriously Jesus' admonition to love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. Because this was at a time in the early 60s when Campbell had lots of enemies for his civil rights work and was regularly in very hostile, angry mob settings. His brother put it even more strongly. Can you love the leaders of the Ku Klux Klan? Well, in Berea, I heard in the late 1960s that Will Campbell was visiting Klan members in prison. In fact, he was even celebrating communion with them, using Coca-Cola and potato chips, which now that I've been in prison, I know is what one can get out of a vending machine in the visitors area. Of course, Campbell's activism didn't stop with civil rights. By the late 1960s, he was protesting the Vietnam War by helping draft dodgers get to Canada. Later, he was actively working to oppose the death penalty. And he kept writing fiction, nonfiction, children's books, and many articles for Catalogate. Although he was definitely a political activist, he always felt it was inappropriate to put one's faith in government to solve all of our problems. That was idolatry. He remained a Baptist, but mainly claimed kinship with the early Baptists who were pacifists and not the Southern Baptist Convention. He held his own worship services at his home with family and friends, and he died in 2013. Probably one of the most important things I learned from Will Campbell is that without justice, there can never be peace. If we haven't learned anything else from the Black Lives Matter movement, we should have learned that. The next hero, or rather heroine, I want to talk about is Dorothy Day. How many of you have heard of her? Can you raise your hand in? Oh, good. Mike Ivey quoted her in a recent Friday update. Dorothy was a Catholic, but she traveled quite a road getting there. And for quite a few years, considered herself a communist, although she always rejected the atheism of classical communism, Marxism. Dorothy grew up in a close nuclear family. Her father was a newspaper journalist, working most nights for morning editions, and her mother was the stay-at-home parent. She was always expected to read good literature, not trash, and to go to college. Her family, however, was not rich, and at times, not even close to middle class. She won a scholarship to attend the University of Illinois, which was fortunate because the Chicago newspaper her father worked for that year went bankrupt. In 1916, her father got a job with a New York City newspaper, and Dorothy moved with the family, dropping out of college after completing 2 years, determined to become a journalist also. She got a job working for a socialist newspaper and became active as a suffragette, going to prison after an arrest in Washington, D.C., and participating in a hunger strike. Over the next several years, she wrote for a number of socialist newspapers, had a number of romantic partners, and went through an abortion. Eventually, she ended up in a long-term relationship with Foster Batterham. And with $2,500 from the sale of screen rights to a semi-autobiographical novel she wrote, she bought a beach cottage on Staten Island, where she lived with Batterham. However, in 1927, over the course of many months, she became increasingly interested in Catholicism and wanted to be baptized. When she became pregnant again, she wanted the baby baptized and to marry Foster. He was adamantly anti-religious, especially anti-Catholic, and not terribly interested in fatherhood. So they separated. This, of course, was a major turning point for Dorothy. In her autobiography, The Long Loneliness, she talks about how much she loved Foster and how wrenching it was to turn her back on their multi-year common law marriage. So the first year or more on her own with her daughter Tamar Teresa brought her little joy. She started writing for the Catholic journal Commonweal about workers' strikes and the struggles of the labor movement. The second major turning point in her life was meeting Peter Marin in 1932. Peter was a French immigrant of peasant background. In his 50s, without much formal education, but extremely well-read. He knew Catholic history and Protestant history also, and especially Catholic social teachings, all of which Dorothy knew little or nothing about. Quoting again from The Long Loneliness, Peter made you feel that you and all men and women had great and generous hearts with which to love God. If you recognize this fact in yourself, you would expect and find it in others. Peter was very passionate about social justice and claimed inspiration from St. Francis of Assisi. Together, they began the Catholic Worker newspaper, and the first issue appeared May 1st, 1933, at the cost of 1 cent, and has been published regularly ever since. Its articles, written by Dorothy and Peter, and a host of famous authors, not only described workers' struggles for fair pay and working conditions, but early on took on discrimination of African Americans and immigrants. The paper's main competitor was the Communist Daily Worker. But Dorothy decried the atheism and the revolutionary theory of communism. During the Spanish Civil War in the late 1930s, the Catholic Worker came out for pacifism and against the just war theory of the Catholic Church. The Catholic hierarchy endorsed Franco in that war, and the paper was shunned by the Church. Obviously, pacifism hurt its circulation during World War II also. But by Vatican II in 1962, its pro-civil rights and anti-nuclear stance was attracting readers again. However, it wasn't the Catholic Worker newspaper that first drew my attention to Dorothy Day. It was the houses of hospitality that she ran first on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and that were copied in many other cities. By 1941, there were Catholic worker houses offering hospitality and food to homeless populations in 30 U.S. cities. Now there must be at least 150 of such places of hospitality. This is how I first came to know about Dorothy Day. When I was 30 and starting a rural health program, I hired a nurse who had been a Franciscan nun, and on leaving the order, she went to work with Dorothy Day in Lower Manhattan. Of course, there was no salary, so she got a job in the emergency room of Bellevue Hospital. Until Dorothy's death, she exchanged letters with my friend about once a month. Beyond that, though, many of my Protestant friends have copied Dorothy's hospitality to homeless folk, inspired by her work and life. Over the course of her life, Dorothy never stopped her activism. She demonstrated against nuclear war in 1955 and served a month in jail. She lobbied and fasted at Vatican II and succeeded in getting passage of a statement that nuclear war was incompatible with Catholic just war theory. She spent time with Cesar Chavez in California as he organized farm workers. And she spent time with the last hero I want to talk about, Clarence Jordan, in southern Georgia. The primary thing I learned from Dorothy Day is that social activism and humanitarian aid go hand in hand. Humanitarian aid is say this again. Humanitarian aid is like pulling drowning folk out of a river that are being thrown in upstream. It's like our blessing box. That's humanitarian aid. Social activism is trying to stop people from being thrown into the river in the first place, changing aspects of our society that make people poor and hungry. Both are absolutely necessary. The final hero I want to tell you about is Clarence Jordan. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of him. Only one hand do I see. He's another Baptist. Clarence grew up in Georgia and got his undergraduate degree in agriculture, but decided to be a preacher and enrolled in seminary. When he finished, he had a doctorate in New Testament Greek. Let me read for you his translation of the Good Samaritan story from the original Greek, published in what he called the Cotton Patch Gospels. Can help you see. One day, a teacher of an adult Bible class got up and tested Jesus with this question: "Doctor, what does one do to be saved?" Jesus replied, "What does the Bible say? How do you interpret it?" The teacher answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your physical strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "That is correct," answered Jesus. "Make a habit of this, and you'll be saved." The Sunday school teacher, trying to save face, asked, But who is my neighbor?" Then Jesus laid it into him and said, "A man was going up from Atlanta to Albany, and some gangsters held him up. When they had robbed him of his wallet and brand new suit, they beat him up and drove off in his car, leaving him unconscious on the shoulder of the highway. Now, it just so happened that a white preacher was going down that same highway. When he saw the fellow, he stepped on the gas and went scooting by. Shortly afterward, a white gospel song leader came down the road, and when she saw what had happened, she too stepped on the gas. Then a black man traveling that way came upon the fellow, and what he saw moved him to tears. He stopped and bound up his wounds as best he could, drew some water from his water jug to wipe away the blood, and then laid him on the back seat. He drove on into Albany and took him to the hospital and said to the nurse, "You all take good care of this white man I found on the highway. Here's the only $2 I got, but you keep account of what he owes, and if he can't pay it, I'll settle up with you when I make payday." Now, if you had been the man held up by the gangsters, which of these three, the white preacher, the white song leader, or the black man, would you consider to have been your neighbor? The teacher of the adult Bible class said, "Why, of course, the one who treated him kindly." Jesus said, "Well then, you get going and start living like that." My introduction to Clarence Jordan was my father telling me that translation when I was a teenager in the mid-1950s. My father also told me about Koinonia Farm, the place in Georgia where Clarence and his wife Florence had settled with another couple, the Englanders, to found what Clarence called a demonstration plot for the kingdom of God. My father may have known about the ugliness that was happening around Georgia during the mid-1950s, but he didn't share those stories with me at the time. However, I'm getting ahead of the story. The Jordans and Englanders bought and moved to Koinonia, in 1942 and 1943. Koinonia in Greek means fellowship. It was 440 acres of worn-out red clay and a falling-apart farmhouse that needed extensive repairs. That's why it took a little more than just a few months to move in. It did have a barn, though, and during spring planting season, Clarence would climb up on the roof of the barn to see what his neighbors were doing in their fields. If they were plowing, he'd plow. If they were planting, he would plant, because he had the book knowledge of the agriculture degree, but not the experience. From the very beginning, Koinonia operated with a common purse and fostered integration. When African American workers were hired to help, everyone ate lunch together. The farm was successful. They launched a poultry and egg business and helped their Black neighbors establish their own flocks and set up an egg cooperative. Clarence designed the first mobile peanut harvester, lending it to others. He instituted a cow library from which families in need of milk could check out a cow free of charge. They joined the local Baptist church. But in the early 1950s, they took a visiting Indian student to church with them, and afterward they received a letter from the church asking them to leave. 10 years after its founding, Koinonia had grown to 19 adults and 22 children, and Clarence was in demand as a speaker in churches around the country, which is probably how my father learned of him and his work. However, life was about to turn difficult. In 1956, 2 years after the Brown School desegregation case, Clarence tried to help 2 African American students apply to a formerly segregated business college in Atlanta. Anger aimed at Koinonia began with threatening phone calls, grew to vandalism, and finally life-threatening violence. Fences were cut, crops stolen, garbage dumped on the property. A truck's engine was ruined by sugar dumped into its gas tank, and 300 fruit trees were chopped to the ground. The children faced isolation and abuse at school. A few years ago, I listened to the youngest of the Jordan boys tell how he had literally no male friends in high school and ate all of his lunches with the 2 or 3 Black girl students in his class. This was in the 1960s and well past the violence of the 1950s, but the social ostracism had continued. However, back in 1956, the county commissioners obtained an injunction blocking the Koinonia summer camp that provided a 6-week experience for inner-city children. One of the accusations was immorality, because the camp permitted the campers to see baby pigs being born. But of course, the real problem was integration. In July of that year, dynamite destroyed the roof of the roadside market where Koinonia sold some of its produce and damaged its refrigerated cooler. Then the county merchants boycotted the farm, not only refusing to buy its produce, but also preventing it from buying supplies locally. At Christmas time, vigilantes fired shots at the farmhouse, and on January 14th, 1957, the roadside market was completely destroyed, with 40 residents of the county watching it burn, and no one helping Clarence put out the fire. From then on, almost every night, a group of cars would come by, firing guns at the farmhouse. Eventually, only the Jordan and Brown families remained, and 2 adults would sit in a car at night at the end of the farm road to prevent KKK cars from coming closer to the farmhouse where their children slept. Will Campbell visited during this time and felt relieved when another older visitor offered to take the bed near a window that had been shot out recently. Dorothy Day also came down on a 36-hour bus trip from New York City to spend Holy Week and Easter at Koinonia. She took her turn in the car wash at the end of the driveway one night when the car was shot at. In spite of her many protests and time in jail, it was the first time she had actually been shot at. And her friends in New York City phoned, demanding that she return immediately to the safety of the Bowery. In spite of much urging, Conrad Brown and his wife, Clarence and Florence Jordan, remained at Koinonia, the only income coming from shipping pecans and peanuts out of Koinonia, with the phrase, "Help us get the nuts out of Georgia." And others who believed in what Clarence had started began to come, including Millard Fuller and his wife, Linda. Millard and his friend Morris Dees had started mail order business in college to finance their education, and it had grown through law school and their legal practices, making them both millionaires. Millard and Linda came seeking answers to the materialism that had taken over their lives, and they found an answer at Koinonia, helping Clarence start another demonstration of the kingdom. The possibility of a poor family obtaining a home with sweat equity and a no-interest loan. The long-term result of that experiment we know as Habitat for Humanity, an organization to which I gave a huge chunk of my volunteer time organizing and running an affiliate, but also one where my daughter gave a year of volunteer work and met her husband. Koinonia is still shipping nuts out of Georgia and is still an intentional community, modeling reconciliation between the races, though Clarence died of a heart attack in 1969 at the young age of 57. What did I learn from this courageous man? I think his life gives us an example and a teaching of faith and faithfulness. Clarence never thought that the opposite of faith was doubt. He believed that the opposite of faith was fear. Fear that prevented one from choosing the right or moral path. Or for Clarence, the path of Jesus. That kind of fear is not the same as being scared. When Dorothy Day returned to the Koinonia farmhouse after being shot at, she was shaking, and someone offered her a coat. She said, "That's not cold, that's scared." No, fear is not the same as feeling scared. Fear is the motive that keeps us from choosing the right, when that choice might affect our pocketbook or our standing in the community, or maybe even lose us a friend. Clarence not only had faith, but treated his opponents with humor. He maybe knew and loved the story of Will Campbell serving communion to KKK leaders with potato chips and Coke. When the first Ku Klux Klan delegation came to the farm to tell him they didn't allow the sun to set on people in their county who ate with, and of course the N-word was used. Clarence responded by grabbing the man's hand to shake, saying, "I've read in the Bible about folks who had power over the sun, but I never hoped to meet one." On another occasion, when he was visiting a church as a Sunday speaker, the minister was bragging about the huge cross on top of the church that had cost $10,000. Clarence told the man, "You got gypped. It used to be you could get a cross for nothing." With that little joke, I'll end this talk and take questions and comments about two of my heroes and a heroine.